right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us. My name is Brooke Loneman. I'm at the Jake Jobs College of Business and Entrepreneurship at Montana State University. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second session of our new webinar series, Advancing Sustainability Research in Organizations, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Planetary Boundaries. While we get started, please invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know your name, where you're joining from, any interest you have in this particular topic on the science and magic of terroir or planetary boundaries more broadly. Um, this series is a collaborative presentation by the Montana State University Sustainable Enterprises Initiative and the Institute on Ecosystems at MSU. We have the IOE Director, Dr. Sarah Church, and Madison Hebner joining us today. Madison, would you like to briefly introduce the IOE?
Yes, thank you, Brooke, and thank you, Kathy, for being here. The Montana State Institute on Ecosystems is a center, part of the Centers and Institutes here at Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana, and we focus on tackling large environmental challenges through interdisciplinary collaboration, focusing on bridging science, education, and community perspectives through that work.
All right, thank you. And just some housekeeping to ensure the best experience for everyone today. Please remain muted throughout the presentation to, minimize background noise while our presenter is talking. And then if time permits, you'll be able to unmute during the Q&A portion after the presentation. And then any questions you have while the talk is happening, please do feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll make sure to address them when we get to the Q&A. So please feel free to be writing those in during the talk. So I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Catherine Zabinski. Our session today is titled Value-Added Attributes of Wine, the Science and Magic of Terroir. Dr. Catherine Zabinski is a professor of plant and soil ecology at MSU in the Department of Land Resources and Environmental Science. Her research includes the ecology of plant and soil interactions, I'm going to mispronounce this, mycorrhizal ecology, and the effects of disturbance and ecological restoration on soil processes. Her recent work in sustainable agriculture is related to measuring soil health across different management practices. In addition, she has written a book on wheat and is currently working on a book about wine and terroir, a topic that we'll hear about today. So Kathy, thank you for being here, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Brooke. And I have been looking forward to talking with this group. It's a different disciplinary set than I'm usually used to talking with. So please, you can ask questions in the middle or if you need clarification. But what I'm going to talk with you about today is really broadly the way that we communicate our academic work, our research to a broader public. And I was inspired by the first seminar in this series 4 weeks ago, this point of communication about wow, or towards a point of discussion towards the end of the Q&A period about like how do we in this kind of this time of urgency communicate things more efficiently. And that is a question that I have had in my own field and many of us share. And I think it's really worth it to spend the time thinking about that. So today, the story that I'm going to talk to you about, or the storytelling process, is related to wine and specifically this concept of terroir. And I talk about the science and the magic of terroir because in my studies, I feel like half of what I read is really more like magic than science, and not necessarily wrong or bad, but it causes me to think about how it is we tell our stories about food or about science or about our research in a way to communicate to the broader public. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about my own background and what brings me to this place, because I'm not a historian, I'm not a geographer, but I'm relying on multiple fields to in my writing about wine. My own work is really based in plant ecology. Oh, let me back up one step first of all. For people who were perhaps not at the seminar 4 weeks ago, I wanted to just talk about briefly about planetary boundaries, which is the framework for the seminar. And this is based on a paper by Rockstrom et al. In 2009, and et al. Included about 30 scientists, and they identified 9 processes on which the stability, the biophysical stability of the Earth system is dependent, and at the same time delineated the safe operating space for each of these 9 processes. And those processes, as illustrated here, are things like freshwater, land system change, biosphere integrity, climate change, etc. So they identified safe operating space and then the region of increasing risk outside of that safe operating space. And the seminar 4 weeks ago included this illustration by the presenters that was basically an update, like here's where we're at with these different planetary boundaries, and how do we encourage in the business world corporations and businesses to think about these this framework in terms of sustainability of economic endeavors, etc. So my own area of research and my own background is related to plants. Um, I have long been fascinated by plants. They are just stuck in a single place and they have to manage with whatever the environment brings to them. And they do that with a number of fascinating mechanisms that are coded for in their DNA. They have much bigger genomes than we do, because instead of a brain that says, oh, wait, it's too cold outside, I should put on a jacket, they have to shift to a different physiological system that says, okay, it's freezing, and now this is what I do to my cells to make sure that I can manage the freezing temperatures tonight or whatever, in not such a conscious kind of way, but the whole world of plant ecology I've just always found fascinating. It was later on after my graduate studies that I started thinking a lot more about the half of the plants that are below ground, the root systems, and how they manage to function in soils and all of the different challenges that soils represent. So when I started at Montana State, I was hired as a restoration ecologist. And restoration ecology, for those of you not in the field, is really it's the science of repairing disturbed systems through human intervention. That we know that ecological systems will evolve, not evolve, but change through time, sometimes evolve through time. Um, and in this process of primary and secondary succession, in some ways it's like a self-repair. But we have scenarios like mining impacts that maybe those areas will revegetate on their own after they're contaminated with metals, but maybe that's going to be 60,000 years, and we don't want those metallated sediments falling into our streams and blowing into windows and landing in playgrounds. So the ecological restoration is really assisting the repair of ecosystem structure and function. And this is a picture taken from one of our capstone courses where students are working at a reclaimed mine site, and it's still obviously a reclaimed mine site when you look at the stream and you see orange water flowing through. It means that it's got a really low pH and the iron is precipitating. But there are also places like this site in Mount Rainier National Park where just recreation, visitor impacts leave areas not toxic, but compacted and a loss of soils. And the question is how do we get plants to grow in those areas or and to manage people to reduce those impacts? Invasive species is another area where I've worked, and there you've got plenty of plant growth, but the question is can we manage for the invasive species and encourage the establishment of a native plant community after we reduce the invasive species? So all of these questions are focused on thinking about what we can do with soils in a way to repair the soils to facilitate plant growth. So it was on my first sabbatical leave, where I spent a year in France, that I really began thinking about agricultural systems. It was just not something I thought about. I grew up in really near the Canadian border in Minnesota in an area where it's just iron mines and lakes. There's no agriculture. And so my framework was always undisturbed plant communities, and that was what interested me. In my year in France, I heard a lot about food and food from different regions and agriculture. I started thinking about agriculture as, in fact, a really unique kind of disturbed system. And the same approach that we use to thinking about how to restore disturbed lands, we could apply to agricultural lands to say, all right, we want to reduce our impacts in these areas. And so instead of adding a bunch of stuff to our soils, can we shift the focus to more reliance on natural processes in agricultural systems? And so I started working with colleagues, Perry Miller and Clayne Jones, and a group of graduate students on studies related to soil health. And this is a picture of one of our sites with experiments related to cover crops. So if you're not growing your cash crop, you can grow another crop to keep to try to address soil health by having plants in the ground for a greater proportion of the year, and specific plants like nitrogen fixers that can impact the soil in a way that would potentially positively in fact impact the cash crop, which in Montana in this scenario is wheat, and also increase the health of the soils for long-term sustainability. That work was quite interesting and challenging because in Montana we're often faced with a real limitation of moisture. We grow wheat in areas where we have just enough precipitation in a given year to produce a wheat crop. So if you're growing a cover crop that could potentially increase soil health, it's also using water that is going to negatively impact the wheat growth. So this sort of dynamic of thinking about how you manage production and think about healthy soils at the same time is just one of the challenges that we have in terms of thinking about agricultural production over the next 50 years. We're in a scenario that agriculture, the practice of agriculture, has definitely contributed to in terms of changing climate patterns and having to adapt to shifts in precipitation and increases in temperature. And also in terms of planetary boundaries, agriculture has been a major contributor to impacting biogeochemical cycles, nitrogen and phosphorus cycling, and how can we better manage nutrients in a way to maintain yields, but at the same time reduce outputs or off-farm impacts. So in this context, I became interested in thinking about, um, so we're academicians and we teach and we do research, and I find teaching, in fact, is a really it's a very comfortable setting to communicate information because you have a group of people in your room who are motivated to get a good grade, and you control the grades. And so you can inspire them to read, to learn, to repeat exactly what you said. And, you figure out ways to be more effective at that. But I mean, basically, they're paying to listen to what you say. I have, as I'm, in the more recent years of the last 10 years of my career, I've been really thinking about, well, I would like to communicate some of this stuff we're learning to a broader audience, to sort of the general public, because we all eat, and agriculture is, I mean, it's been very successful in producing enough food to feed the world as long as we don't have any political limits to food distribution. But there have been obvious environmental costs to that. And if we're going to shift the way that we do agriculture, it's going to be because of really a broad shift in the will of a lot of people to inspire governments to say, okay, yeah, we're going to subsidize a different approach. So this got me thinking about stories that we can tell to the general public that can attract them to thinking about agriculture and their food in a little bit more in-depth way. So, it was actually when I was working on a book about wheat that I first started thinking about terroir. And this was the result of some work coming out of Stephen Jones' lab. He's retired now, but he was the head of the bread lab in Washington State, and talking about terroir and wheat and how you could produce flour with different taste from different regions. And I, I mean, that sounds great. And part of the point of that story was, instead of just sending our wheat to three different mills in the country, we we build smaller mills, and we've got a local wheat production and local bakeries. And in his area, there were bakeries in Seattle that were interested in getting specific kinds of bread or specific kinds of flour to make this artisanal bread. So, but I wondered, is like, well, really, can you really taste the difference? I mean, I know wheat varieties and wheat regions based on the climate have an impact on, absolutely, on the type of flour and the qualities of the flour and the type of products that you produce. But this link between soil and food quality, I was like, is that really true? And so it led me to grapes and to wine, because that is clearly the food stuff that's got the tightest link with terroir. So to back up a little bit, um, terroir has many different definitions, and there's a lot of different understandings of what terroir is. I'm going to talk about first the agricultural definition, which is the one that, for me, in my frame of reference as a plant ecologist, makes the most sense. And that is that terroir is the ecosystem in which your crop plants, in this case, let's say grapevines, interact with the soil and the climate and the topography. And the things about the soil that are most important are things like the soil temperature and the water supply and the mineral supply. Those are all things that you can control with irrigation, with fertilizer, and with different kinds of soil covers. And with this way of thinking, you could approach this whole question with this, okay, the quality of wine then is largely dependent on the terroir in which it is produced. So you, as a grape grower, could control your terroir and the quality of the wine. So this is a really functional agricultural definition. In contrast, oh, I'll come back to this picture later. But let me just explain what this is, because this is a beautiful illustration of terroir from the region in France, the Chablis region. And so you've got these steep slopes, and on one slope you can see this vineyard planted in what is clearly very rocky soils. On the opposite slope, where the soils are not rocky, those are wheat fields that are waiting to grow. And then up above the wheat field is this forested area. So this is clearly an area where um, the decision about what you're growing is dependent on the soil type. And you're not ever going to grow wheat in a soil that looks like the vineyard soil. Like it's just not going to happen. So, all right. The old broader view of terroir says that, okay, you've got the physical and the biological environment, but you also have a set of human factors, which is really important to consider because wine is not just a product of farming like the grapes are, but then you process those grapes into wine. So there's the whole culture of, in fact, decisions you make about when you're harvesting and then decisions you make about processing the grapes and how you make your wine. That all also seems pretty understandable, like that's all good. But then there was also this like retail and marketing component. And for me as a plant ecologist, I was just like, well, wait, now how does that work? And so this now I want to explain that by thinking about three regions in France and the both the physical, the biological environment, but specifically also the marketing of those three areas. So roughly, these three circles on the map, the upper one is in the area of Burgundy, and the one on the left in the Bordeaux region of winemaking. Burgundy and Bordeaux are the two. If you want to buy expensive French wine, it's most likely going to be from one of those two regions. And they talk a lot in those regions about their specific terroir and how that results in this incredible wine that's produced. And then the third region, which is not one of the French wine regions, but is a geographical area that I'm just lumping, is the south of France. And I just want to contrast the wine in these three areas and the terroir story and the origin of that terroir story, because I kept circling around this to try to understand like what exactly does terroir mean and how exactly does it confer quality on food? Because if we could understand that from wine and we can apply it to other aspects of agriculture, there's some really obvious benefits from that. So I'm going to start out and we're going to have to go back in history in order to understand this story. So this is a typical picture of a Bordeaux vineyard. You see this big chateau in the background. And so Bordeaux wine, uh, Bordeaux region gets mentioned a little bit in ancient times as maybe there was some wine grown there, but it's not really a very, very big wine production time. And by ancient, I mean like the time of the Romans. But it really came into its own with like in the 12th century. And you've got Eleanor of Aquitaine who marries Henry, who 2 years later becomes King Henry, and their youngest son is King John. And King John is wanting to generate. So Eleanor is from this part of France. It was not a big wine growing region at all. But now her family has a great deal of influence, and she's interested in supporting that region and those lands. And so what King John did, her son, was work out an agreement with Bordeaux for the a special tax break so that the ships that left from Bordeaux would not be taxed, and the ships carrying wine that arrived in London would have priority over ships from other regions. So he was doing this because Bordeaux was also a big shipbuilding place, and he needed support for his army in order to do major conquests. So, okay, I'll give you these tax breaks, et cetera, et cetera. So, wine at that time probably did not taste very good. This was before we had bottles and corks. And so you put wine in barrels, and then as it starts oxidizing, it turns into vinegar. So, if you have priority and you can sell your wine first before it turns to vinegar, you've got all the sales. So, in fact, people in London started buying Bordeaux wine because it wasn't taxed, so it was cheaper, and it was the first one that arrived for the season, and so it still tasted good. And so Bordeaux became an area that generated money as a result of all of these wine sales. Not necessarily high quality wine, and not necessarily because Bordeaux is a great place to grow grapes. The next important thing that happened in that area was that Dutch merchants and Dutch men with money moved into that area and bought up land. And with their expertise, they started putting in drainage systems and drained a whole bunch of marshy areas. So this photograph, which is of a place where you can get very expensive wine, is the beneficiary of that drainage system, one of the beneficiaries. And this is a really gravelly area. You're not going to grow anything else in there. But because of the money that was in this region, there was more money that went into viticulture, like growing grapes, better techniques for that, and better wine production methods. So the Bordeaux region is famous for making red wines that are a blend of multiple grapes. And part of the reason they're growing multiple grapes is they've got some areas that are just, or multiple varieties. They've got some areas that are just gravel, some areas that have clay, so all these different things. And so they produce this blend, primarily reds, but also some whites. In contrast, now we're going to go to the other expensive wine region in France, and that's Burgundy. And you'll notice in this picture there isn't a chateau anywhere in sight. And you can see you've got these strips in the vineyards of different colors. And this is obviously a picture taken in the winter. And the different colors are different ground treatments, whether people are growing plants or leaving the soil free or putting on some kind of cover over the winter. And what happened, Burgundy is just culturally totally different. The reason that you have these strips of land is related to the French inheritance system where when when you die, there's a prescribed your property has to be divided amongst your kids in equal shares, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's a tax, and you have to, before you get your inheritance, you have to pay sometimes a fairly significant tax on that. So what happened was land property got split between siblings, and you end up with these little strips of different ownership. So this area was an area that had wine and grape growing from probably before the time of the Romans, the Celts, but then even so the Romans grew a lot of wine here. The 6th century, Gregory of Tours writes about locating the home and the center for the bishop specifically in this area because it produces the best wine. So, from a very early time, Burgundy was famous for producing good wine. Again, none of the wine probably tasted very good, but it was there. There are a lot of nice stories about the origins of terroir being linked to the monks and the monasteries, that after the Romans left, we don't really know that much about the wine business, except that the records we have, which are recorded by people who could write, we know that monks and royalty, who both were able to write, kept records of wine growing. And so we know that they were important in terms of the winemaking business. The other interesting thing about this region in comparison to Bordeaux is that Philip the Good in the 16th century said, "We are only growing Pinot Noir grapes here. The other varieties, which Gamay and Beaujolais, you have to rip those up, and Pinot Noir is the only grape that we're going to grow." And then that was the red wine, and the white wine was Chardonnay. So instead of blends, you have a single variety of grapes that are, and there's exceptions in different parts of, in the southern part of Burgundy, but the bulk of it is Pinot Noir or Chardonnay. Part, and not just part, the reason for the dominance of these two regions in comparison to what I'll talk about next, the south of France, if you look at the geography of these areas, so Burgundy is, Dijon is the north end of Burgundy. You've got a river that takes you to Paris. So if you're transporting wine in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, you have a way to move it. You have to get it to the river, but then you have a fairly easy way to get it to this big market in Paris. Bordeaux is close enough to the Atlantic that you can transport wine, you get to the Atlantic, and then you get the whole European Union and the northern countries. So both of these regions have access to a market. The south of France, in contrast, and again, I'm lumping a bunch of different areas in the south of France together, but wine has been grown there for a long time, clearly since Roman times. It's easy place to grow wine. We talk about hill slopes in Burgundy and the crest as having the best wine. In part, topography is so important in Burgundy because of frosts and north slopes versus south slopes. You're going to have frost on one of those, so you're only growing wine on the other. In the south of France, it's easy to grow wine. It's easy to grow grapes. It's easy to make wine, but they have no easy access to markets. Well, sorry, I don't really have a way to go back here. Oh yeah, I do. If you look at the south of France, uh, the only way to get to England is to go around Spain through the Gibraltar, the Strait of Gibraltar, and around the Atlantic. That was a really, really dangerous shipping route. And across the country, you don't have you've got mountains to cross. Like it just, you can't possibly transport wine in any kind of reasonable way. So even though this was a very prolific wine area, they are primarily producing wine for that region. You've got Italy that produces its own wine. You've got the other side of the Mediterranean that is mostly Muslim and not drinking wine. So, in fact, this area became known for inexpensive red wines and it was a staple. Like everybody drank wine. It wasn't anything like a luxury beverage. So, what really, for me, started to make sense about the origins of terroir relates to something that happened across Europe in the late 18th century. And that is the introduction of this little root aphid, um, which is commonly known as phylloxera. And it was first noted in Europe in a greenhouse in like 1860 in London. And I should back up a second here and say there are about 60 different species of grapes. There is one that is the source of all of our wine, and it originated in the Middle East and then spread throughout Europe, and that's Vitis vinifera. So in North America, we have probably 30 species of grapes, wild, and they can be very prolific. So in the 19th century, when there was a lot of botanizing and gardens and greenhouses and the like, there was a big interest in bringing plants from North America and South America to gardens in Europe. And American grape species were one of the sort of interesting plants because they grew so prolifically, like they were just abundant and rich growth, and but they didn't really produce grapes that Europeans were interested in terms of winemaking at all. But in the process of moving these American grapes around for botanical interest, they inadvertently also transported this little root aphid, which doesn't have much of an impact on American grapes. They're quite resistant to it. It forms galls on the leaves, and that's about it. But it showed up in a vineyard in the south of France, about 20 miles outside of Montpellier, in the late 1860s. And, it's like, okay, the grape plants, the grapevines on this side of the vineyard are dying. And by the next year, the whole vineyard, like all of the plants had died, and it had jumped to the next vineyard over. And it was spreading from one vineyard to the next across the south of France. And uh, people were like, wait a second, this is really serious. What are we going to do about this? So Burgundy, Bordeaux, Paris, they're just like, boss, it's the south of France. They don't know what they're doing. Their fields aren't very healthy. This isn't our issue. So within 10 years, it was their issue. And in fact, this little aphid decimated almost all the vineyards across Europe. With that, there was a whole bunch of effort into how are we going to manage this and a lot of different solutions. So in the South, they said, okay, these American plants are not impacted by this. We're growing American grapes and we are going to figure out how to make wine from them. And then they started forming hybrids. We're going to cross them with the French grapes and we'll make wine from that. And everybody was enthusiastic about it, but you have to wait some years, 5 years before you've got grapes, and then you make the wine, yada yada. Nobody liked the wine. And so there was a whole school of thought that in fact we should just be applying sulfur, which they had successfully used for powdery mildew that ravaged the vineyards 10, 15 years earlier. And with that we can kill this, but in fact these are in the soil, and so we had all sorts of, they developed fumigation systems. They'd pump this sulfur into the soil to try to get it to the roots, and in the South that was hit earlier, they started much sooner grafting, in fact, grafting the roots of American grapes with the shoot of French grapes. In the northern part of France, in Burgundy and Bordeaux and in Paris, they were just like, oh, we don't like these American grapes. Like they taste foxy and this aroma is like a wet fur. It's not like flowers. We're not doing it. But eventually everything shifted to that. But in the meanwhile, and this is a statue that you can see in Montpellier, which is a tribute to the American grape saving the French grape industry. But in the meanwhile, there's all sorts of fraud. Like anybody can put the Bordeaux label on their wine and get more money for it, and who knows where the grapes are from. So multiple pushes from Burgundy and Bordeaux and regions that made money off of their wine to say, wait a second, we need some sort of system for geographical indicators for our wine. So that if you say Bordeaux, we know it's from this region. So this whole approach evolved into this AOC system. It's the Appellation Origine Contrôlée. So in fact, and this took till the mid 20th century, there's a lot of requirements. It's not just a geographic region, but if you want to have this AOC label, you need to have grapes from that region and specific varieties of grapes and specific techniques in the vineyard, the spacing of the plants, and some specific processing like wine making functions in order to have this label. So for a long time, for decades, it didn't really matter. Like most people were like, "Oh, it's more expensive to buy the AOC. I'm buying the wine made here that doesn't have that label. It's fine." But by the 1980s, the market shifted enough to people drinking less wine, but of higher quality, that the system really took hold. And that, in fact, is a big part of the basis of our understanding of terroir, because the ideas that of this regional typicity got, or a specific kind of food from a specific area, which is really an inherent part of the French culture, got codified in this AOC system. So it's easy from outside of France to say, well, this is just kind of an elitist thing, and is this really necessary? Like, whatever. But in fact, it gets used in France and in the US as a way to add value to your product. So some Burgundy or Bordeaux wines are very expensive, the most expensive wines that you can buy, but those expensive wines account for 5% of the wine sales from that region. So the 95% of the wine that's produced, and primarily by small farmers, small production systems, they need to have a way to compete and to be able to sell their wine. Also, the south of France, which traditionally had this, okay, that's just sort of the table wine and low quality. They have over the last 20, 30, 40 years really focused on improving the quality of their wine. And now you've got the specific terroirs. In fact, what terroir does, because it's specific, it's like, okay, this geographic region and these soils, this climate, and this cultural approach produces a unique food quality. It allows areas, farmers from outside the dominant areas, to say, we have a product that also has a unique story. And this is why you should buy our product. Here's our story. And Terroir has in fact really been useful for helping farmers tell a story to consumers about that region. So partly it has to do with the labels on the bottles, and then partly it has to do with a whole nother aspect of the market, which is related to wine tourism. So now to go back to thinking about these stories and the challenge for us. So we make this assumption, I make this assumption as an academician, that people can make better decisions when they're well educated about a problem. I'm really interested in having more people think about sustainable agriculture and what that means and how that impacts their daily life and their table and everything else. So, so the question is that really that I struggle with is how do we communicate effectively to a broader audience that doesn't have the same motivation of I got to get an A, I need a GPA, and and that isn't trained necessarily the way that we're trained. I get reminded of this when I start working with a new grad student who says, "Wow, I read these papers and I don't get anything out of them." And it's like, oh, okay. So here's, you have to learn how to read this really dense research literature. And you do, like we do, like that's what we do. And it's after a while, it's not hard, you pick it up. But and then you write papers and everything is in this really truncated, concise, technical version. I have been told by a science writer who was started in journalism, well, really you scientists shouldn't write. Like, leave it to us. Just make sure you talk to us. Your job is to do science. That's fine, but I disagree. I feel like as a scientist, I have an inside view of a whole lot of questions and a whole lot of processes. The challenge is how do I communicate that in a way that's accessible to a broader audience? So I think I'm just going to end here, but and open it up for some conversation in any of the time we have left about how, why, and how we tell stories and what stories we tell. There's been a really big push in science to, storytelling is a way to communicate what we do. But like all of our science isn't necessarily a good story. I mean, there's a lot of my stories that end with, I don't know, like I'm not sure yet, or I need to know this or that, or like that's just not a very satisfying story. And so it's a challenge about how we do this in a way that can engage people and motivate them to be interested in the things that not necessarily the details of how this plant root and this fungus interacts, but really the details of how do we grow enough food over the next, decades to feed all of us in a way that isn't going to be stretching those 9 planetary processes further from where they're at right now. So with that, I think I'm going to stop and I would love to open it up to discussion.
Thank you, Kathy, very much. That is, as Adam said in the chat, a fascinating history of wine and terroir. And actually, if Adam, if you're willing to unmute and ask your question to kick us off, that would be great. Otherwise, I can just read it aloud.
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, fascinating talk, Kathy. I guess, yeah, the two parts to the question. How much of terroir is recognizable taste in a product versus a more conceptual connection to place? And And then kind of the second, just following up, is there space under the terroir concept for prioritizing purchase of products that are grown in locations that make sense for sustainability, um, from a sustainability perspective?
Mm. So clearly, you can taste differences between wines. There's no, and where it gets to be a little magic is it comes down to sort of what you attribute that taste to. And there's so many. I mean, you've got grapes, you've got grape juice. Then you decide if you're putting stems in with the grape juice, which is more tannins, and then you decide like the relationship between the juice and all the mushed up grapes, and then you decide what is it, an oak barrel, and is my like there's so many things that impact the flavor of the wine. There are some wine books that are all about um, soil. Like, okay, we're just gonna, if you drink wines from calcareous soils, this is what you're gonna taste. And if you drink wines from granitic soils, this is what you're gonna taste. And depending on where the calcareous soils are most commonly distributed, like, okay, yeah, but that's also the Mediterranean region of France and it's hot and it's dry, yada, yada. So there's just
Mm.
those stories. If you come at it from a science perspective, it's just like, ah, is that really true? Part of it is, part of it is not. Um, the one thing about sustainable places to grow wine, it's really, I feel like in France, it's grapes are not easy to grow. They just take a lot of effort. If you could grow something else on that soil, you would. And when you see these pictures of vineyards from France, they're growing on soils that you're never going to get anything else to grow. I mean, and they have restrictions about irrigation. Like you can maybe irrigate early in the season, but after that, not at all. And so I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it's really they're growing in the most sustainable way that
Mm.
for the most part, there's obviously exceptions. In the new world where we're expanding and saying, oh, okay, we could make a lot of money off of this crop, I feel like that it it's a different question. But yeah. So the question about linking the stories, and in some ways, Brooke might be able to address this better than me about sustainability in sustainable wine production. There's all sorts of there's organic, there's biodynamic, there's like different indicators that address how grapes were grown, and some of the most like out there, which I consider I put biodynamic in that category, are in are like Burgundy in some of the really the most expensive wines. But I think that has to do more with appealing to the market for the people who spend a lot of money on wine. But anyway.
Thanks, Kathy.
Go ahead, Madison.
Oh, I was just gonna say, Perry, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I assume you can hear me. So, Kathy, looking at those photos of soils, it seems almost fraudulent to call that soil. Like, is it really rock from surface to depth? I mean, there must be something else in that matrix. And then it got me to wondering, is this a situation where mycorrhiza become really important for connecting, those root systems to mineral acquisition?
Yeah, good question. I think in definitely in the Chablis area, with which is where you saw some of those, you've got like some layers of clay at depth. So they are going through differently. It's not just unconsolidated materials. Um, I don't, and they are soils. There's so much rock though, in a lot of these vineyards. It's amazing. Like you would never consider that farmland for anything else. The mycorrhizae story is another question. It's There have been some studies about mycorrhizae, and there's a part of this terroir thing, which you can imagine my response to, is that, oh, there's probably the soil microbiome that really affects the terroir. There is. And then there's the whole microbiome of the yeast vat, like, or of the like of the barrel, the yeasts, the different yeasts that have different alcohol tolerances, etc. What I know about mycorrhizae and vineyards is that they are there. I haven't really seen great studies about plus or minus or the amount of contribution. The really difficult thing in studying this kind of root system is that it's deep and you can't really dig it up and say, okay, like where are the mycorrhizae? How heavily are the roots colonized? So it's more looking at the soil community and are mycorrhizae present, which the grapes are not the only thing growing in that field. So yeah, so there's a lot more about mycorrhizae that we don't know about yet.
And then there's just to wrap up, David Deephouse has a comment. I think it's important to distinguish place-based attributes like made in Vermont or local, and soil-based attributes like gravelly, sandy, and loamy. And then mentions that Bill Buford wrote about volcanic soils making the best wheat in France. And David, I don't know if you wanted to unmute and ask a further question or just mention that book about dirt and cooking. Um,
No, this is just a really fascinating presentation and really gets into the cultural and regulatory histories of terroir and wine. That's something that's, I see developing all around me here on Salt Spring Island, British Columbia. So this is just really informative to the way I'm living now as a faculty member in phased retirement.
And actually, I loved Bill Buford's book. I read his article in the New Yorker right about the time that I was first thinking about terroir and was quite inspired by that whole discussion. I would still want to have a long discussion about wheat and soil versus climate. Uh, but yeah.
well, thank you. And thank you, everyone. That's our time. Thanks for joining us. And a note, thank you so much to Kathy. Let's give her a round of applause virtually. And thank you so much for sharing your time and your research with us. Our next webinar will be April 1st. We'll have a set of speakers talking from the organizational perspective about sustainable agriculture and forestry and corporate supply chains. So more information to come on that shortly. And thanks again. We hope to see you next time.